he told me he was going to fire Georgie Benton in the corner.
Well,
because in between the first and second round, Georgie told Mike that he had to stop moving away from Julian. He said, Mike, you got to go right at him. And Mike said he looked at Lou Duva and said, you hear this guy? Go right at him. He almost knocked me out.
Okay, so if we go right back to the beginning, to the early life and influence for yourself, so what inspired you to get into boxing, and were there any sort of particular figures or moments that sparked your passion for the sport?
Well, so like I said, I'm originally from South Florida. I was born into a military family. My mother's father was a naval corpsman. He was Irish, full-blooded Irish, drinking, fighting Irish. And my father, at the time when I was born, my father was in the Army. My grandfather had ended up working on Homestead Air Force Base, and that's where I was born in South Florida. But my father wasn't very active in my life as a child, so I was mostly around. The only man I was around mostly was my grandfather. However, my mom is also she was also very prominent in my affinity for combat sports, because my mother is the type of person who doesn't back down from confrontations. So my mom solved a lot of her problems in school through fighting. I tell my fighters a story about when I was in grade school. I got jumped, and I didn't want them to call my mom. She had to work 2 jobs a lot when I was a kid, and but my eye was puffing up, and I didn't want them to call her and bother her at work, but it puffed up to the point where it was starting to close. So they called her, and when I was sitting in her truck, she asked me how many of the guys that jumped me did I knock out. And I was kind of a little flabbergasted by that question, because I just remember getting hit by a lot of people. I was swinging back, so I hit somebody, but I don't know the result. Like, I don't think I knocked anybody down or out. I was maybe 12 years old at the time. I think I was in 6th grade. And when I told her to kind of recap what happened and said, well, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then I ended up against the wall getting beat up, her face didn't change at all. And she just kind of looked at me and went, so none? You didn't knock out any of them? And I was like, I don't know what the right answer to this is. And she said, listen, you don't understand. She said, if that ever happens again and they're walking away from you, chase down the last one, jump on him, and start hammering him until somebody pulls you off him. If you do something like that, I'll be proud to come pick you up. And I was like, okay. So that's like the mentality that I was taught as a child. And her father, my grandfather, I tell my students another story about him. He kind of punched me in the lip when I was 6 years old. We were like play boxing with each other, and he just kind of, hit me. And I remember going like this, and he tried to, a few minutes later, after we'd calmed down, he went like that again, and I ducked my head, and he said, good boy. So he learned boxing from naval combatives, and the role he was in the military, he was a corpsman, so he was a naval medic. But when you become, and it was during Vietnam too, so when you become a naval corpsman, you have to take Marine and Navy combatives. So back then, they were very boxing heavy. He watched boxing. He watched a lot of sports, but I remember watching boxing and wrestling with him as a kid. That was like the only male bonding I got. There wasn't a ton of conversation because he drank. So, we didn't really, when we discussed any kind of issues, it was mostly arguing. And then when I did spend time with my father, he also had an affinity for combat sports. So my father's Afro-Latino, so like he's black, but from Spanish-speaking country. And so there was always, in households, when you're a kid and you're half Latino, there's only like 3 Spanish-speaking channels at the time. So during the day, the only 2 sports they would show would be football, soccer, or boxing. So whenever the boxing was on, I would really focus in on that and watch that. That's as a kid. That's where I first saw Michael Carbajal, and he was like one of my early favorite fighters, and Jorge Paez. So it's like I liked how about business Carbajal was, and at the same time, I liked how playful and full of joy Maromero Paez seemed to be in the ring. And like those are the things that really kind of pushed me to wanting to learn more. But as a kid, I did everything. As a kid, I did whatever kind of combat sports I could get my hands on. Just boxing was just one of the most consistent throughout the years.
Yeah, Michael Carr was a little hands of stones, wasn't he?
Yes.
His fights with Gonzalez, Humberto Gonzalez, they're legendary.
Yeah, they were epic. Yeah.
Yeah. So you also mentioned your Cuban heritage.
Yeah, so I have Cuban blood on both sides of my family. On my mother's side, and ironically enough, like from the opposing races, like on my mother's side of the family, the Cubans are white, and on my father's side of the family, the Cubans are black. So it kind of comes from both ends. Although I wasn't very close with that as a kid because of how my mother and father split up. Like when I was 3, my mom ended up having to move back in with her father, and that's like how I ended up being around him so much. But that's it became more of like despite the fact that I grew up in South Florida and I was around a lot of Latino people, primarily Puerto Ricans and Cubans, I wasn't very in touch with the Latino side of my heritage. That actually became more prominent after moving to Vegas and becoming the manager of Johnny Tocco's. It was like, the older I got, the more I wanted to know about it and learn about it and be partisan to it. And the more I started studying what the development of the Cuban system and their work with the Soviets in kind of like pushing a lot of things in boxing that weren't being done at the time.
Yeah, because I know you know your history as well. So when you probably came to boxing, I thought maybe you would have taken a deep dive into the Cuban history of boxing as well, because there's some great boxers there as well, aren't there?
Yes, yeah. It's just, although again, like it really took a turning point, because when you go back to like the Kid Chocolate and Gavilan, Luis Angel Rodriguez, they called him El Feo. The guys that kind of also inspired Muhammad Ali, because when they defected from Cuba, they ended up in Angelo Dundee's gym in Miami. But those guys, if you looked at their styles, they looked like American boxers looked at the time. And that's because, at the time, Havana was still influenced a lot by Western culture, like the mob presence. This before Castro took over. So once Castro took over, and Cuba went in that direction, and then they established the relationships with the Soviet Union. At the time, the Soviets were really like doing a lot of innovative stuff in boxing. Just the way they looked, I've looked at footage from those early days of the development of the Soviet system. They did not look like the way Western fighters looked. So once that happened, those fighters left Cuba. Their influence was no longer, that prevalent. They became more American, and then the Cubans started taking the way it's described is they took everything the Soviets did and added salsa dancing to it. So that's when they really started to kind of form their own look and identity. Like outside of that, before that, the Cuban boxers, they looked like Kid Gavilan fought a lot like the way Ray Robinson fought. There wasn't like huge differences in the way the styles looked and were performed and the basic principles that they taught. That really has to be credited with the Soviet influence.
Yeah, but I don't know how true it is, but I did hear that Kid Chocolate, Robinson, was influenced by the style of Kid Chocolate as well.
Yeah,
I don't know how true that is. But then, yeah, that would definitely agree with what you're saying about Gavlan being similar to Robinson as well.
Yes.
Interesting, isn't it? How the styles sort of intertwine, isn't it?
Right.
Okay, so eventually you moved to Las Vegas. So what motivated you to move away from Florida to Las Vegas, and how did that move impact your career in boxing?
Well, so honestly, the truth is, I'm not dissimilar from a lot of people who kind of turned to boxing, which was something I had only half-heartedly done throughout my life, because I didn't know where my life was going. You know, I was close to being 25 years old. I didn't seem to have much direction. I didn't have ideas for the future. I felt like I had missed out on opportunities. I went to college for film, but that wasn't going anywhere, you know, the way I wanted it to in South Florida. And the thought occurred to me at 25 years old that I want to do something with my body before I lose my athleticism. So I essentially became the kind of youngish man who now I question their motives a little bit when I get the same kind of guy coming into the gym, but I didn't know what else to do with myself, and I had joined the Share Dog message board, the forum, and at the time it was gigantic. It was one of the biggest forums on the internet, and through that forum, I got to know a guy who was living here in Vegas, who was actually training at Johnny Tocco's at the time. Although I didn't know anything about Johnny Tocco's from living in South Florida, but I just took a chance. Like I didn't 100% trust the guy, but I was like, you know what? I have to do something in my life. I have to make a move. I have to dedicate myself to something and go for it. And no matter what the end is, like to any end, I'm going to pursue this, and I'm going to go about it the right way. Like if I have to go to Las Vegas and try to get into the scene and earn my way, you know, up the ranks, then that's what I'm going to do. So it was really just almost a kind of the desperation of an aging man, you know, even though I wouldn't consider myself aging then as much as I consider myself aging now. But
25 is young, isn't it?
You're a kid, yeah, but you don't. When you're 25, you're a kid, but you don't feel like a kid. You know, like you feel like everything is epic. So at my age now, you tell guys like that, hey, settle down. You have plenty of time, you know. But and I still deal with, like, a lot of my students are around that age, and I see the same anxiety in them, that they're like, I have to make a move in my life, or, you know, and I tell them, yes, you do. But, you know, I made a lot of mistakes. Even in making that decision, I'm happy I did, because it led me to where I am now. But at the same time, I hit a lot of pitfalls in that amount of time. But that's essentially what inspired it. Was just, I felt like I needed to make a move in my life. And it came down to, do I do MMA or do I go into boxing? Because at the time in Florida, when I had started training again and getting my physical prowess back to where I wanted it to be, I was still doing Muay Thai and I was still, you know, practicing other things. But the most consistent combat sport that has always come back around to me in my life was boxing. So ultimately, I was like, you know what? I've always loved boxing the most. I've always felt most mentally and emotionally engaged by it. So at the end of the day, I just kind of picked that one and then came here.
So you ended up managing Johnny Tocco's boxing gym?
Yeah, at first.
How did that come about?
So when I got here, at first I was just kind of training on my own. The guy that I moved here to, so I moved here to train with his trainer, who I ended up meeting years later. But and it was Livingstone Bramble.
Oh.
So yeah, he told me that he trained under Bramble. So I moved here with the idea that I would also be training under Bramble. But when I got here, this guy was trying to talk me into other things, and after only like a month or two, I was like, I'm not gonna deal with this guy. So I kind of made my own way here in Vegas. One of my mentors who I worked for in Florida at the time, I was working my day job. I worked at GNC's. So the owner of the GNC franchises that I worked for in Florida actually came here and talked the franchise owner into hiring me here. So I got a decent job pretty much right away. From there, I was able to get myself, more economically stable so that I wasn't dependent on this guy. And ironically enough, working in that GNC is where I met Kofi Jantua. And Kofi Jantua was he was coming down. He was like in the twilight of his career at the time. He had just fought Dimitri Pirog not too long before I met him. So
Dimitri Pirog, the Russian.
Yes, yeah. Kofi had recently, I think he lost the decision to him. They fought, and I think they fought in Germany, or they fought in Europe. It wasn't in the U.S. But so he was kind of like in the downslope of his career. But I met him, and he's the one that offered to take me to Top Rank. So that's how I ended up. First, I was training at Top Rank Gym, and that's where I met Richie, and that's where I met Mike.
Gotcha.
So yeah, like I didn't go to Tocco's until they told us that Top Rank Gym was no longer going to allow people they didn't allow people from the general public to train there already, but they were even going to further tighten it to where you had to be signed by Top Rank to actually train at the gym. So they were kind of like wanting to remove everybody who wasn't signed by Top Rank. And Mike had been training another one of his fighters. I believe it was either Bebu Shumanov he was training, or Korobov at Tocco's. Like they were already at Tocco's. So I just kind of like followed along with those guys.
So what were the challenges, some of the biggest challenges you faced when you first started managing the boxing gym, Johnny Tocco's?
Well, so managing Tocco's was difficult because right when I got into that position, the owners kind of pulled me in and offered me the job at almost a karmic time in life, because the store I was working at, the owner was setting that store on like a crash course for failure. Like his whole entire life was collapsing, and he was trying to like hide it from us, but we could tell something was going wrong, the people who worked there. But so the owners of Tocco's kind of pulled me into the office one day and asked me what I thought about possibly managing the gym. And from what I was told by the owner at the time, the reason they picked me was because I was the first person there every day. I was there before the gym opened. Like I'd be out front, I'd be out in the parking lot shadowboxing before the doors open. The reason for that was because of my work schedule. It wasn't really like I was that dedicated, but at the same time I was like, well, the main reason for that is because I only have an hour to train. So if I do my 30 minutes of shadowboxing in the parking lot before you open up, then I'm not wasting time. I was just trying to be economic with my time. But they liked that. So they were like, this guy's here even before us. And then he was very close friends with Chad Dawson's conditioning coach, who was a guy named Axel. And the owner had called Axel, and because they were very close friends, and he said, hey, this guy Lou, who trains with Mike McCallum, do you know him? And he was like, oh yeah, I know him. I used to see him at Top Rank all the time. And he's like, well, what do you know about him? And he's like, well, he's probably the most consistent guy I've ever seen in the gym. Like if I come to the gym at 10 o'clock every morning, he's guaranteed here. And he puts his work in, he does his work, he doesn't BS around, he does exactly what he needs to do, and then he moves on with his day. And then he also told him that because he knew I had a job, so like I would shower and change into my work clothes at the gym. So like this guy literally just comes to the gym, does his workout, does whatever Mike needs him to do, puts on his work uniform and goes to work like every single day. So they offered me the position and I got in there. But the problem was that the gym was very in the red at the time. Like the previous manager had been letting people train there without charging them. There was just no real organization to how the gym functioned each day. And what I brought to the table was consistency, in the office, and enforcement of the structure that they wanted to implement. And then also, probably I would say one of my biggest contributions was telling them that trying to attract pros, like I use the word seduce, like trying to seduce pros to train at your gym so that you have people who have a name training there and you hope to capitalize off their name. I didn't think that was a very good strategy. The main reason is because the most problems I ever had from people training at the gym were usually pros. And they were pros who wanted special treatment. And when I say wanted special treatment, I mean more like demanded. They wanted things for free. They didn't want to pay dues. They wanted to defer me to, like, hey, it's the first of the month, you got to pay your gym fee. And they wanted to tell me to talk to their managers. And I'm like, I don't have to talk to your manager. Like, if you're telling me that your manager pays your gym dues, then you pay me and have your manager pay you back. Like, my problem is money needs to go to the owner of this gym. Like, that's, my problem has nothing to do with your problem. Your problem is you need to get reimbursed by your manager. But it was always like a problem, like it was always some type of issue, whereas I told them, I was like, well, who pays the most without fussing? Who's the most consistent in terms of treating the gym respectfully is usually parents of amateurs. So I told them that I felt that we should really invest more heavily in our amateur program. And I also told them, I was like, we spent so many years getting pros in here that the gym doesn't really have an identity. Like, what does a Tocco's fighter look like? You know what I mean? Who is a Tocco's fighter? We don't have many homegrown fighters who were trained here from the ground up and moved up to the point where, they were national level amateurs or, very high regarded, and then turned pro based out of this gym. Like, we didn't have that. Instead, we had, oh, so-and-so used to train here, or so-and-so used to train here. It's like a list of names who spent a period of time at the gym, but was it really their home? I don't, you know what I mean? Like, so when we did that, that's when things kind of started to really go a lot better for the gym.
So, you mentioned going to the amateur program, whereas Johnny Tocco's has a rich history of a lot of big names training there. So did you then go away from hosting the pros? Because that was the almost main selling point of Johnny Tocco's, wasn't it? All the famous names, like going back to Sonny Liston, which you were training there, weren't they? So did you actually sort of separate the two then?
Kinda. At the time, during my tenure as manager, we became less known for that. I mean, we would still do it. Like, if a pro wanted to train there and like rent the gym out, like rent out the back room where Hagler and Hopkins trained at, if they wanted to do that, that was still available to them. And we did have some camps there. And during my tenure there were some pretty big name fighters who did still train there. But we gave a lot more time and effort toward the kids who were beginning their boxing experience there, or kids who had been there for a little while and wanted to move up. We were giving them just as much focus and attention as everybody else. Like, so one thing that happened was when I started encouraging a lot of the coaches to register as many of their young fighters as they could, with make sure that they have USA Boxing pass books, make sure you have your credentials so that we can go to these amateur events and have a presence, because we didn't have that previous to that. I mean, it was there, but it wasn't like, nobody was like, oh, I want to go see that guy who trains at Tocco's who's an amateur. It was more like, they would come to Tocco's to see if a certain pro was training there, and if they weren't, they just leave. Like there was no incentive to keep them there. During my tenure was more where it was like, okay, all the coaches, we try to be on the same page where we're developing our fighters to the degree where that's our attraction, is that you can come here and learn how to fight. Like you can come here from nothing and learn how to fight. And instead of hoping one of those guys is here, you can come here and become one of those guys. You can come here and make yourself known and build yourself up. This was before I actually started coaching. It was just kind of like an idea of that we needed to focus our attention and resources more on the people who were homegrown within that gym, as opposed to who was just using the gym as a place to do their normal business, because they would do that anywhere. I got into a few arguments over times with pros, and so did the owner. Even while I was there, it might not have even been me, it might have been the owner, where the pro has no sense of like, oh, I'll go through anything for this gym. It was more like, if you don't give me what I want, I'll just leave. And that's, again, I'm not talking down on pros in general, because obviously pros are an essential part of the sport. The end game of most fighters who want to make it in this sport, you want to be a professional. But at the same time, what I'm saying is that the intense 100% focus on trying to get as many of already established pros to train at our gym was a mistake. Like, it was costing us money, where we needed to focus more on developing our own fighters. Like I said, like, who is a Johnny Tocco's fighter and what do they look like?
Yeah, I mean, as someone myself who I run my own gym and I manage it. If a pro does come to train, then they're expected to train for free because they are a pro, and generally it would be the pro's going to begin some sort of business because people say this pro's training there, for example. So yeah, I understand where you're coming from a management perspective. The gym needs to run, doesn't need to be able to run. And
yeah.
the money comes from the amateur fighters and guys who just want to use boxing as a hobby, get fit, maybe do some competitive boxing as well on the white collar scene. So yeah, definitely. I sort of agree with what you're saying there. Yeah.
When I first went to Top Rank, there was a sign on the wall, and the sign said higher level professionals pay $200 a month. Preliminary level professionals pay $150 a month. Amateurs pay $50 a month. That was the sign at Top Rank when I first went there. So that was one of the first experiences of the business of boxing in Vegas that kind of cemented in my head was, well, the high level pros should pay more. But when I went to Tocco's and started managing the gym, it was the exact opposite. Like the higher level the pro, the less they expected to pay.
Yeah.
I mean, and that, again, that's not all of them. There were a lot of don't get me wrong, there were a lot of very cool pros. I mean, there were guys who would pay 6 months of dues up front. There were guys who did not mind paying extra. There were pros that trained at Tocco's that would pay, if they saw a kid in the office saying that they couldn't pay, they would pay that kid's dues. So again, like I said, it's not like I'm not saying it's a blanket thing. It's just the most reoccurring thing I saw the most was that, like I said, I told the owners the people I have to chase down the most tended to be professionals, whereas amateurs or kids, their parents would come in and, hey, how much do I have to pay for his membership? So that's when we kind of started to shift in the direction of building our own team, and then once I started coaching, I became part of that too.
Yeah. I mean, there's different hats, isn't there? I mean, I'm a boxing coach, and I manage my own gym, run my own gym. We have different goals, and we have different ambitions. Not every coach who coaches has a goal of eventually training a world champion. Some of them just don't. They don't want the hassle of training with pros. They want to stay with the amateur kids and
Yes.
they won't go into the pro scene. Or some people know that, I mean, my gym has around 100 members, but some people will say, well, you know, you want to build a gym where you can support yourself and your family.
Right.
Everyone has different goals, don't they? So yeah, when it comes from a management perspective, I totally understand where you're coming from there. The gym needs to be able to run and support itself and the people that are working there.
Right.
Because if you haven't got enough money, then you're not going to be able to train anyone.
And you know what? The gym I'm at now, because Tocco's doesn't operate, and the gym I'm at now is having the same issues. So it's the same story no matter where you go. Like, the coaches and gym owners, like we know this song. It's the same. It's the same lyrics no matter what country, no matter what language. It's the same.
Yeah. It's no easy task being a coach as well. If you just want to train a pro, the amount of time it takes into developing a fighter. I know where you come from there. Okay, so you mentioned Richie Sandoval. Now,
Yes.
he was a bantamweight world champion, I believe.
Yeah, he beat Jeff Chandler for the bantamweight title, and Chandler was known as like a mini Bernard Hopkins. Like, he was a very, very good, very skilled fighter. And if I'm not mistaken, when Richie won that title, it was a upset. It was a very big upset.
Well, I interviewed James Gogi as well, and he actually mentioned Richie Sandoval as well. He mentioned that Sandoval came to one of the gyms he was at, and he mentioned that how good Sandoval was and how much he learned from being around Sandoval and watching him. So how much time did you spend with Richie Sandoval? Because he was your first sort of mentor, was your first coach. And what are some of the most valuable lessons you learned from Richie Sandoval?
Well, he was my first coach here in Vegas, and to be honest, it was an incredibly difficult experience. I'm not going to I'm not going to disparage Richie, because I do think that ultimately Richie's a good guy and a good person in his heart. But the fact of the matter is that he had residual damage. I don't know if you know what happened in the fight with he and Gaby Canizales. Yeah.
Weight issue, was it?
Yeah, I think he lost 30 pounds in like 2 weeks.
Wow.
Maybe less. And the interesting thing is that when I got to Top Rank and first got with Richie, Jesse Reed was there. And Jesse Reed was Canizales' coach at the time. So Jesse was part of that whole ordeal. And when I asked him about it, he said that they knew that Richie was heavy. And when Gaby was offered that title fight, Jesse said, well, why would we agree to that? That guy just fought at 135. There's no way he's going to make 118 in a couple weeks. And he was told by the promotion, by either promoter or somebody's manager, I don't remember who he said, but he said they assured us, they're like, no, he'll make the weight, but he needs to defend the title. And if I'm not mistaken, he was under threat of being stripped of that title. Because if you look at his record, he got the title, and then almost immediately within the next fight, he was fighting at a higher division. He was up at like 122 or 125. And then he fought as high as 135 before coming back down to defend the title. Yeah. I think, if I'm not mistaken, but yeah, so Jesse Reed, I mean, he told me, he was like, I knew there was no way Richie was going to make that weight safely. I didn't think he'd make it at all. And in those days was same day weigh-in. So he didn't even have the 24 hours to rehydrate, which still might not have even worked, but he had to fight the same day. So essentially he had no water on his brain, like he was completely drained of fluids, and got knocked down 7 times. And, I asked Richie about that fight, and he told me, he said, when I rewatched that fight, the one thing I keep yelling at my younger self is, why do you keep getting up? He's like, after like the second or third time I got knocked down, I should have stayed down. But, your fighter instincts kick in. And I think he was in a coma for like a week or 2, something like that. But no, I don't, aside from he had mood swings. Like, that's what it was. He had like unpredictable mood swings. And I don't attribute it to a fault of his own. Like, I don't think that he's a malicious person, but I was only with him for about 6 months, and I ended up going with Mike because I just couldn't take working under him any longer. However, if I have to say something that I learned from Richie was how to fend for myself in this sport. And because the reality is he didn't think much of me when I first got to Top Rank. He thought I was wasting my time. He thought that I didn't belong. He thought that he treated me like it. You know, he was also the least expensive coach there. I mean, Floyd Mayweather Sr. was there. Mike was there. Eddie Mustafa Muhammad was there. There were plenty of other coaches. Roger Mayweather. I met both Floyd Mayweather Sr. and Roger Mayweather at Top Rank. But Jesse was there. Richie was the least expensive. So going with him was partially an economic decision. But there was a time, and it's interesting because this happened against one of Mike's guys, where I got my butt kicked in sparring. And you're probably familiar with this, where you have coaches in this sport who, when their fighter does poorly in sparring, they seem to take it personally. They seem to behave in a way as if it's like a negative reflection on them. And they will become more irate even than the fighter. So Richie kind of did that and was like very upset with what he considered my lack of performance in the gym on that particular day. And again, I was sparring one of Mike's guys. So the next sparring day, what I did was I came into the gym, and Richie had like a little office in the back. I bypassed the office. I walked right past it. I put my bag down, and I went to that guy. I can't remember his name. And I told him, I was like, hey, you want to get a few rounds in? And he was like, yeah. I didn't say a word to Richie. I didn't even go get him. 30, 40 minutes later, I'm in the ring boxing this guy, and Richie comes out of the office, and I'm doing it by myself. And he said, hey, are you getting your ass kicked all over the place again? And I looked out of the ring, and I said, what if I am? And then I went back to it. But then he actually paid attention to me. And on that day, I did a lot better. And I was holding my own. And that guy that I was sparring, and Mike, gave me a lot of respect. When I got out of the ring, Richie said, oh, okay, well, maybe you got something. But that's what it took to earn any regard from him at all. So that if there's one huge takeaway from my time with Richie, it was that there are times in this sport where you have to take initiative yourself and kind of like show everybody who you are and what you're made of.
So were there any sort of particular habits or training methods which stood out when you were around Richie Sandoval, which you don't see?
No, honestly, not really. He didn't spend a ton of time on not with me. Again, I don't think he was interested in developing me. Like, I think he thought that I was just like a delusional 25-year-old guy just trying to get started, because he had been around the gyms since he was a kid too. You know, like he told me stories about how Oscar De La Hoya and Shane Mosley were like 7 and 8 years old in gyms in Pomona when he was a teenager, you know, when he was like a high-level amateur. So I just don't think he thought a lot of me. Like, I don't even remember how many times we ever did mitts or anything, but that was the bulk of what he did, was mitt work, you know. And that's common throughout boxing nowadays. You know, you have guys who that's their whole career, and women now too, that's their whole career also. But Richie was kind of like an earlier version of that, and because of his mood swings, it's like 1 minute he would be there watching me shadow box, and then I'd look for him between rounds, and he's just not there. Like, I think he's off somewhere arguing with somebody or doing something. I don't know. That's ultimately why I went to Mike and asked him if he would coach me.
Yeah, Mike McCallum. So for 5 years, he was Mike McCallum.
In between 4 and 5. In between 4 and 5 years.
But that must have been quite the experience because McCallum's an all-time great. But we don't seem to hear much of him now. For some reason, he seems is he quite reserved in what he does. So how did you find? How was the experience of training with McCallum?
Also difficult, but for different reasons. Don't get me wrong. Mike has a brilliant boxing mind. He has a ton of knowledge in his head, and he trained with 3 of the greatest trainers in the history of boxing. He trained with Georgie Benton, he trained with Emmanuel Stewart, and he trained with Eddie Futch. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. And also, I found out that his amateur coach in Jamaica was Cuban, because at the time, the Jamaican national team hired a Cuban trainer to, help them out and round them off. He spent a lot of time as an amateur sparring with Bunny Grant when Bunny was a world level pro, and Bunny was trained by Harry Wiley Sr., who was Ray Robinson's trainer. Yeah. So Mike had to have been around him. I asked him about that one time, but he didn't. That's the thing, is that Mike's not going to tell you a whole lot. Like, I don't know if it's a cultural thing, because I've met a lot of Jamaicans who are very tight-lipped, but from what I understand, not too long before me, Mike had he was training a guy who was Samoan, and me and this dude, we got pretty close because I didn't meet him, and he did train with our group, but Mike poured everything into him, and this guy in the gym, when he sparred, he looked a lot like a cross between Shane Mosley and Mike McCallum, like how each of them bought. He was very smart, incredible instincts. I saw this dude. This dude had no pro fights, and I saw him beat up numerous pros. And he was a super middleweight, and I saw him beat up heavyweights. But he went nowhere. He went nowhere. Just got off track a lot. Life decisions. Him and his wife had 3 or 4 kids during that amount of time, and nothing ever happened with it. And from what I understand, and I learned this from other people, because Mike never told me himself, but from what I understand, it just kind of broke Mike's heart that he poured he really opened up and gave this guy everything he knew, and it didn't go anywhere. So when it came down to me, my roommate at the time, who also trained with him, and a few other people who trained with him, Mike didn't want to go that far. Unless he felt like you were guaranteed to go somewhere, he wasn't just going to give you everything he had. All of the stuff that I got from him about what Eddie was like, what Emmanuel was like, what Georgie was like, are things I had to really ask him. I had to sit down with him, like you and I are talking right now, and be like, Mike, tell me about this. I want to know. And at that moment, he would open up. But it's there were 2 separate things. Being in the gym and talking about those guys were they almost had to be separated, where personally, in retrospect, as a coach myself, I would have blended them together, because you're passing on the knowledge. But he was just very reserved in passing on that knowledge. So it was tough. And then on top of that, because he was a great fighter, without question, great, he didn't always know how to communicate how to do something if it didn't come naturally to you.
Yeah. That's often the argument, isn't it? Not the argument, but it's often what you hear against great fighters that became so each to them because of their natural talent, that they can't always pass that on to people who are training when they do start to become trainers later on in life, or why so many great sportsmen don't become great coaches, because it came so easy for them, so they can't understand why someone else doesn't pick up the same way they did.
Right. Yeah. So there were times where he would keep repeating to me like how to do, like your hook doesn't look right. Okay, let me throw my hook again. No, still not right. What's wrong with it? Then he would do it and go, do it like this. And I would do my best impression of that. Okay. And he'd say, no. Like, give me what am I missing? Like, I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. So there were a lot of moments like that of frustration where there was like an impasse. Like, and I'm the type of person where you have to really be able to explain to me like what's wrong with something. You know what I mean? Like, I don't have much patience for implication. Like, don't imply something. Just tell me. Just say, hey, you have to do this, 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 and this. All right, okay. But don't tell me do this and then ask me why I didn't do the 3 other things that you were implying that need to be done. So I would get frustrated. He would get frustrated. But at the same time, we had a great love for each other. I mean, I learned a lot from him. Like, in my early days as a coach, when I was still in fighting shape myself, and I would move around with my students, they would say, Lou, why are all your counters to the body? And like, body snatcher, like, because Mike was my most prominent mentor. So every time if I slip a punch and I hit you, I'm probably going to hit you in the body. Like, that was one of the biggest things that he emphasized. And again, he did give me a lot of the knowledge. I don't want to say he didn't give it to me, but again, he gave it to me separate from gym practice. So it was like implementing it into physical practice is something that I kind of had to do for myself.
It's very interesting you mentioned, because I didn't know what you said about Mike McCallum being, when he was in Jamaica, and his coach was trained by Harry Wiley Sr.
Yes.
Of course, Ray Robertson had some pretty brutal uppercuts to the body as well, and left hooks. So what do you think made Mike McCallum such a good body puncher?
Well, okay, so here's something where I can kind of veer into the technical aspects of being a coach. When you say talent in athletics, what do most people think of? Like, if I say to you, that kid over there is talented, what do you think that means for most people? For most people, it means he's strong, fast, agile, some physical characteristic, right? Or he has good-looking muscles, But there are a lot of talents. There are a lot of things that are talents, should be considered talents, that get overlooked for those physical things, because those physical things are more attractive to the eye. But focus is a talent. There are some kids you meet who are just incredibly focused. Like, you don't have to tell them to focus, they just do it. Timing is a talent. Developing timing is difficult. Like, I have fighters who are good fighters who have like no concept of timing. Like, when is the right moment to throw a punch? Instead, they'll insist on throwing the punch at a wrong moment and then wonder why it doesn't work out. Patience is a talent. Like, there are so many other talents other than strength, speed, durability. There are so many non-physical talents that get overlooked. So one thing that Mike had a bunch of those types of talents. Like, he had if you watch when he fights, he almost never loses focus. His ability to concentrate during a fight is like second to none. Determination. He has an incredible determination, and determination is difficult to foster. Like, how do you teach a fighter to be determined? How do you teach a fighter that and a lot of coaches would say you can't. They would say, if a guy doesn't have it in him to fight back when he's getting hurt, then you got to just let them leave. But that's not true. Like, there are plenty of fighters, you hear, you know, plenty of fighters, legendary fighters who came up. If you listen to their coaches, when their coaches first met them, they weren't like that. You know, that's something that they learned gradually over time. Plenty of those guys walked into the gym because they were tired of giving up on themselves. So you can foster determination, but determination is also a talent. Like, there are people who are just born with the ability to fight back, and Mike was like that as well. Like, Mike was very I don't know what's the right way to say this, but if you thought you were going to get the better of him and he figured out that you think that, he's going to go to great lengths to prove you wrong. You're not getting the better of me. There's no way. I don't care if you're Julian Jackson. You know, I don't care if you're Donald Curry. You're not getting the better. I know you're supposed to get the better of me, but it's not going to happen. Like, he could generate that from within. Like, he had that. He had those kind of abilities. A sense of distance. Like that. A sense of distance is a gigantic overlooked talent. I trained a kid who made it very high to the national level amateurs in the U.S. and he's a pro now. He's still undefeated if I'm not mistaken. I don't train him anymore, but I would tell people that he had an incredible sense of distance. Like, he was very good at just perceiving how far away he is or how far away the opponent is. So he did not make the mistake of throwing punches from too far away very much. Mike was like that as well. So he had a lot of those things, and then on top of that, quality education.
So with Mike McCallum training with those coaching relations, man, still Eddie Fudge, Georgie Benton, are there any philosophies that you've picked up from Mike McCallum that you have incorporated into your own training methods, which McCallum would have got from those three great trainers?
Yeah, definitely. So setting distance and establishing a jab, that was something that Emmanuel Stewart was huge on. And if you look at the way he trained Vladimir Klitschko and Tommy Hearns, even though I kind of felt like Emmanuel Stewart reveled in his own creation with Tommy Hearns a little too much. Like, there was like, and I remember watching tons of fights where Emmanuel Stewart just brings up Tommy Hearns, like when he was a commentator for years, you know, like he would just bring up Tommy Hearns and I'd be like, dude, not everybody's Tommy Hearns, you know. But Mike would tell me that Emmanuel was very big on setting the jab, establishing the jab, setting the right distance that you need to operate from. Eddie Futch and Georgie Benton were obviously defensive specialists, more so than anything else. Even though Eddie Futch did train a few aggressive fighters, the main thing he wanted from them was to not just take damage in order to be aggressive. Georgie Benton was very much like, you know, Mike would tell me that his idea of standing in front of you and not letting you touch him, you know, like constantly like hiding right in front of you. He's like, that came from Georgie, you know. So yeah, and I mean there's a lot more, but you know, could keep going on and on forever. those I would say are probably like the main points. That and countering to the body. Like I'm very big, despite the fact that it's not favored in the amateurs, I'm very big on teaching my students to invest in body punching and to invest on countering to the body, if anything, to offset the rhythm of the other fighter. Like, it doesn't even need to be, we don't even need to be trying to score points with body punches in a 3-round amateur fight. What we need to be doing is upsetting the other guy, is throwing him off his game.
Yeah, and yeah, it makes the transition as well to a higher level a lot easier as well when you've already got that sort of pro level base in the amateur game as well, because it's a fine line as well to sort of juggle when you're doing the 3-round amateur boxing, because it's so fast paced. But yeah, you want to add in some of those pro concepts as well.
Right.
Okay, so the old school training, So can you elaborate on what distinguishes old school training from modern techniques, and why you believe the methods are still effective today?
Yes, I was thinking about this right before connecting with you, and I was thinking about, would I even refer to myself as an old school coach? And I'm gonna be perfectly honest, I wouldn't. Like, there's a lot of reasons why, but I wouldn't want to turn the term old school into like a tagline, if that makes sense, because I'm not. Like, that. The fact of the matter is that I'm not. Like, we're here in the modern age. We are modern trainers. Like, we're here in the modern age, and even if I adapt principles from past times, learning from history should be part of any modern age. Like, you want to be improving upon the things that came before. You don't want to be dismissive of them. And so I think the basic ideology of a modern coach who's dismissive of older principles versus a modern coach who learns from past principles, that's a distinction that I could say has a certain amount of significance. And this is also because I don't want to diminish the more prevalent role in the life of a boxer of the trainers that came before us by suggesting that I myself am like an ideal example of that, because the fact of the matter is I'm not. And I learned this by reading, at the request of my very good friend Daði Osterson from Iceland, gave me a copy of the book Cornerman. And when I read that book, it really like opened my eyes as to what being a trainer is all about. Nowadays, professional fighters have staff. They have the conditioning guy, they have the nutritionist, they have this person, they have the therapist, they have staff. In those days, the boxing trainer knew a little bit of all of those things. A boxing coach could have a comprehensive conversation with a doctor about the physical health of a person, of a human being. Now, I do like to model myself after that because I have those as goals, but it's not on the same level, because nowadays, if you do that, you do it as a choice. You don't have to. Whereas in those days, in order to be competitive, you had to. You had no choice. Like, if you wanted to function within the sport, and even nowadays, when I say fighters have staff, nowadays sometimes the coach and the mitt holder are two different people. And like in those days that happened, but not like it is now. Not like it is now with a lot of the Instagram, mythologists, and all that stuff. But and again, like, if you're gonna do that and you have your staff, I guess is the right word, again, compartmentalized for a fighter, that each person knows their role and the goal of the person, they know, everybody knows what direction they're moving towards as a collective. Okay. But I like to try to fashion myself as, like, I can do most of that. Like, I don't need to subcontract necessarily. But at the same time, again, like I said, like, I'm a modern coach, like, for sure. Like, I'm 100% for sure a modern coach. I just have a penchant for studying what came before and then trying to build on it. Like earlier when we were discussing the Cuban influence, and I was talking about the Soviets revolutionized a lot in boxing. Like they really did. And to the degree now where I'm seeing gyms in your neck of the woods offering Soviet style training programs, like they have like the standard European style, and then they have Soviet style. Like you can tell that a lot of those coaches have learned from trainers who learned from those programs and are now kind of implementing it in their gym practices, which is good. Anything that grows the sport is fine by me. But there's a difference between learning that and actually learning from that and implementing it, as opposed to being one of those guys. Because those coaches were different. Like the Soviet coaches were subsidized. I mean, a lot of them still are, but they were subsidized. So like they literally could just sit around and think about boxing all day and what they could do to improve it. Whereas here in the U.S., most of the coaches can't do this full time. They have to have a day job. So half your day is spent thinking about your day job, and then you get off at 4:00 and go to the gym. So really, your mind is divided. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I thought about the question of would I consider myself an old school trainer, and it's like, but how can I? Like I'm not. I consider myself more like a hybrid, more like somebody who's of the modern age, but I'm trying to bring certain basic ideas back. But I wouldn't ever say that I'm like a Harry Wiley or that I mean, Harry Wiley trained Bunny Grant, trained Sugar Ray Robinson, and I don't know if you know, but he trained Muhammad Ali for the one fight where Angelo Dundee was in the other corner. I can't remember I think it was who he fought.
Jimmy Ellis, maybe.
Ellis, yeah. Okay. Yeah, and Ali was so impressed with Wiley's abilities and his mind that he told Angelo, he said, Angie, I'm gonna keep him. Like, I'm gonna keep him on. And Angie was like, okay, are you gonna say no? You're gonna say no to Robinson's coach? You're gonna kick him out the camp? But Wiley didn't. The only reason he didn't have a career resurgence is because he passed away the year after that.
Yeah, Harry Wiley Senior is a very underrated coach because he was with Robinson the whole time, from amateur through his pro career as well.
And he had Armstrong too.
Yeah, Philly White and Henry Armstrong. And people you could argue that Robinson, Armstrong, Ali were the three greatest fighters of all time, and Wiley Senior was he was there for each one of them in some capacity. But yeah, I think George Gainsford was a little bit more outspoken, so he got more in the headlines when it came to training Robinson and managing Robinson. But I think I heard McCallum say that it was Bunny Grant, who was responsible for McCallum's body punching.
Yes,
of course, that made that link with Harry Wiley Senior. It'd be interesting to ask the question. It'd be interesting to see what sort of techniques they had for that body punching, because that's a very rare connection there, isn't it?
Mike told me that Bunny would hit him so hard in the body that his foot would come up off the ground. He'd be in the corner and his lead foot would be coming up off the ground, like when you instinctively raise your knee to try to protect your midsection. And he told me that years later they were at the Jamaican Sporting Hall of Fame does like a yearly event, and they honor Mike there every year. And when Bunny was still alive, they did the same for him, because he was the greatest fighter out of Jamaica before Mike came along. And he told me that they were in a hallway by themselves, and he said Bunny was just kind of standing across from him, giving him a look, and and he said, so Mike, you learned the body punching from me, yeah? But you the body snatcher, huh? you learned my body punching, but you the body snatcher, eh? All right.
I think something you mentioned as well was McCallum's focus. That sort of made him that more maybe why actual average of that body puncher for Monica, because you guys fighting guys like Julian Jackson, you got to be focused, sort of stand in the eye of the storm. Those punches that come back, and those, because he hit Jackson some brutal body shots, didn't he? But to stand there, stand your ground, be in position to throw those shots against, arguably the best one-punch hitter in history. And you've got to be mentally very strong and have those qualities you mentioned about determination and focus.
When he gave me an interesting story about that fight. He told me he was going to fire Georgie Benton in the corner.
Well,
because in between the first and second round, Georgie told Mike that he had to stop moving away from Julian. He said, Mike, you got to go right at him. And Mike said he looked at Lou Duva and said, "You hear this guy? Go right at him." He almost knocked me out. He said, I was ready. I was going to tell Lou, "Hey, Lou, you got to get this guy out of the corner, man." But he said he something in the back of his head said, "Just hear him out." And he said, "What do you mean? Like, what do you mean I got to go right to him?" He said, "Mike, you're at the end of his punch." He said, "You stay at the end of the punch, he's going to kill you. You have to get in. You have to go under. Go under. Roll underneath. As you're coming up, catch him to the body." He said, "You got to do that, Mike. You stay outside, it's over." And he said, if you go back and watch that fight, you can see Mike come out like very anxious in the second round with his back heel like 5 inches off the ground, as if he's digging his foot in to prevent himself from moving back. And as soon as Julian starts swinging, you see him like cover and start to move. and he told me, he's like, "I swear I bit a hole through my mouth guard of just the sheer tension of trying not to get killed by this guy." But he said the moment he caught him with, I think, a really nice uppercut, he heard Julian go, "Ugh!" And he said, the moment I heard that, I said, "Oh, I got you. I got you. You can dish it out, but you can't take it. I got you. You're mine." And he's like, that's the moment that he knew. And yes, so again, like overlooked talents. It takes focus, determination, concentration. It takes those kind of things to be able to pull off something like that against a guy who you're completely physically outmatched by. Because Mike admitted that Julian was stronger, faster, and hit harder than him.
Yeah, I mean, we've all heard. I think Kronk made it well known that when you fight someone with power, you don't run from the power, you run to the power. But it goes
against your instincts.
Yeah, and how many people can pull that off? Against Julian Jackson's natural power. If that was the case, then Jackson would never want to fight. But
exactly.
You got to be great yourself as well to pull those sort of tactics off. To run to the power and smother Julian Jackson's power, stand in the face of that. Yeah, so it does work both ways. It's not as simple as go smother the power, because we haven't got a chin like McCallum had as well. I don't think he was ever knocked down, was he?
No, well, he was down against Tialzo and Roy Jones, but that's it. And both of those are his last 3 fights.
Yeah, so he was never stopped in that fight, was he?
No. And he told me that, I mean, a lot of fighters say stuff like this, but he told me that against Tialzo, he had the flu. So he had taken cold medicine. He caught the flu, I think, on the way to Italy. So he was already like not feeling very well. And I mean, again, though, like fighters say stuff like that, that's the reason. But at the same time, to say that you've only been down twice and both were world level guys, and one was Roy Jones Jr. in his prime, and he didn't, and neither guy could finish you. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we still hear about those fights with James Toney, don't we? McCallum and James Toney, about being sort of the standard, isn't it, for the sweet science, especially that first fight. And McCallum was 11 years older. McCallum was 11 years older, 35 years old in that fight compared to Tony's 24. If he had been a few years younger, that would have been even more intriguing fight than it already was.
I don't think he universally agreed with that, because remember when I got with Mike, I was turning 26, and I was very anxious about my age. And Mike is the main one who told me, "Why are you worried about that?" He's like, Don't worry about that. He's like, you're just now starting to come into the prime of your life. when Mike lost to Kalambe, he attributed a lot of that loss to being very obstinate and hard-headed and not being able to take it well if a fight wasn't going his way. So through in his older years, he learned more to kind of go with the flow and take a fight as it's happening, round by round. So I'm not 100% sure he would agree that youth would have helped him. Given if you're saying if he was the same version of his younger self, as opposed to the wiser, because he would probably say that if he could get the physical prowess and keep the wisdom that he got with the age, then yeah, he probably would have done much better, if not definitively won. But he didn't have the philosophy that he very much backed the idea that youth is often wasted on the young.
Well, I think for that fight, they refer to Mike McCallum as the aging artist. So yeah, really what you're saying, yeah.